Hi, good morning. I'm Dr. Roberta Chevret, Associate Professor of Communication Studies and Women's and Gender Studies faculty here at MTSU. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new faces this morning as we get ready for another exciting conference. My favorite time of the year. So, for the past couple of years, the Women's and Gender Studies Research Series has partnered with the LGBT plus conference on programming one of our WGST faculty for the Thursday morning educational spotlight. And so it is with pleasure that I get to introduce our next speaker. Before doing so, I want to encourage students to check out the Women's and Gender Studies minor, graduate certificate, and student organization, SAFE, who I believe will have a table here at the conference. And our class offerings the next semester include sexuality studies, always a good time there, multicultural women's voices, feminist theory, and gay and lesbian literature taught by none other than our next speaker, Dr. Eric Hughes. Dr. Hughes is a Tennessee native and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee Southern, an MA from University of Northern Alabama, and is a proud alum from MTSU, where they completed their PhD in 2021 with a dissertation titled The Rural Queer Experience in 20th Century American Fiction. Dr. Hughes was a winner of the Virginia Peck Award while here, recognizing outstanding scholarship in English, and is also founder of the Lavender Closet Project for Gender Affirming Clothing. This is a local nonprofit you can connect with on Facebook, so go ahead and look them up. I also asked Dr. Hughes for a fun fact before coming up here and learned that he has a cat named Margot after the Gwyneth Paltrow character in the Royal Tannenbaums. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Hughes.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you, Dr. Chevret, and the conference for having me, the Women and Gender Studies program, and the College of Liberal Arts for sponsoring. I'm just very excited to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about contemporary AIDS literature. I've always wanted to use this title, so it was a little bit indulgent of me to use Queers Read This, but we will be discussing that nice polemic a little bit later. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, I do want to apologize. I did have to cut one of the novels I was going to discuss. Until I practiced yesterday, I did not realize three novels may not be, maybe a little too much for one presentation. So I do want to suggest, though, the information is in the description. The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles is another great contemporary AIDS related novel. So we are going to be focusing on two today. To kind of backtrack a little bit, this research is honestly a lot more about posing questions at this moment than having a lot of answers. So when we think about the contemporary world, right, in the post-marriage equality, post-Obergefell kind of world, we often think of being in this kind of moment of progress, achievement, uh, queer inclusion and acceptance. So, if we are in this great kind of position now, politically, legally, socially, then why are contemporary writers, most of them who are young, my age or a little bit older, why are they going back to this dark, quote unquote, period, right? This injurious, depressing period. What is what I call the exigency behind this retrospection? Why go backward, right? So I don't have a solid answer to that question. I do have some hypotheses that we'll kind of talk a little bit about. So to kind of get to the heart of that question, I'm focusing on two novels today. One is Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian, And then My Government Means to Kill Me by Rashid Newson, which I think is a great title for a novel, honestly. So the first, I kind of give you a breakdown here. We have three teenagers that the story follows. Reza, a closeted queer kid or teen. Art, a very openly gay character. And then poor Judy, named after Judy Garland, whose uncle is dying of AIDS. Now, they are at the epicenter of the AIDS crisis as being in New York during the period of 89 and 1990. So they're trying to navigate queer identity, their relationships, so on and so forth, in the midst of this kind of very tumultuous period. With My Government Means to Kill Me, Trey Singleton moves from the Midwest to New York City. There, he gets kind of involved in the kind of sexual subculture through the bathhouses in New York. But then, midway through the novel, suddenly things change and he becomes more socially conscious. So he starts working at an underground AIDS hospice run by a lesbian, which has historical precedent, and then joins the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was the main organization behind direct action and protest around the AIDS epidemic. ACTA. We'll come back to them a little bit later. Now, I do want to note that what's interesting is both of these are post-marriage equality, right? And marriage equality is 2015. So we have a novel from 2019, and then My Government Means to Kill Me is even newer at 2022. Both of these are historical fiction in the fact that they place fictional characters within real historical moments. And that, I would argue, is a kind of key part of this question of why this return, right? Why do this to your characters, right? So now, not only are we in this kind of moment of progress, we're also in what a lot of people have kind of deemed the post-AIDS world, right? So not only is HIV now a manageable health condition for most people who have access to resources, we know that people are still dying of AIDS, that so on and so forth. So HIV is easily managed for the most part. And Not only that, now we have things like PrEP, which are meant to prevent HIV infection to begin with. So you would think in this moment, like we should kind of see this as a post-AIDS world, so on and so forth. Now, the problem with that is twofold. Number one, it denies the reality of the spread of HIV and AIDS still ongoing, the fact that some areas are not going to have those resources, people in some areas are not going to have the resources to manage their HIV care or access things like PrEP. So it denies that. And number two, it makes it easy to divorce ourselves from that past, from that moment that has profoundly shaped modern queerness, right? Queer identity, queer politics, all of that shaped our position in society. So when we kind of use what Paul Butler calls the post-AIDS discourse, we start to get separated from that history in kind of key ways. Now, it makes sense that we would try to latch on to a post-AIDS discourse, right? So as Butler notes, this is a psychic need for the queer community in some way, right? So by distancing us, he says, by distancing itself from death, illness, and the stigmatization of AIDS, the queer community has avoided linking a context of shame, fear, and horror with queer identity. Now, that's important. We don't want horror to be to be the kind of defining adjective around queerness. But what that does is kind of position us in this overly idealized form of queerness rather than acknowledging the historical reality. Furthermore, what is more important for my purposes here is by declaring the end of AIDS, we get divorced from that history. from an identity. We know queer identity in the present has been formed by the medical discourse surrounding the HIV epidemic. We can't deny that reality. So in this post-AIDS world, again, why are our contemporary writers still concerned with this period? Now, Andrew Sullivan's piece, written in 1996, is kind of critiqued as the kind of advent of this post-AIDS discourse, fairly or unfairly. Either way, his piece, When Plagues End, signals a shift in how we talked about HIV and AIDS, how we talked about queerness, so on and so forth. So 1996 is soon after the protease inhibitors were released onto the market, and that is what has made HIV a manageable condition, right? So as Sullivan says, it's no longer a marker of death, but a marker of illness, right? It becomes something manageable. So while Sullivan gets a lot of critique, he does actually kind of bring up some points that I think are salient here as well. So he says that now that we have to acknowledge the end of this per his argument, then now we've got to kind of look retrospectively, right? Instead of having to fear, are we going to have a future? Are we going to survive the present? Now we have to make sense of the past. Now, what a lot of scholars will say is that this is a premature declaration of now being in the future, right, in the post-AIDS world. So he ends with this kind of utopic statement. He says that, quote, living is not about resolution. It is about a place where plague can't get you. Only once or twice did I find that place, but now I live in the knowledge of its existence. So will an entire generation. So this is a very, again, a utopic statement where we kind of get this ideal world where HIV/AIDS is no longer, a dominant force or what have you. So again, this is kind of gesturing toward that. Now, what a lot of queer theorists, I keep walking away from my microphone, what a lot of queer theorists have talked about in general is that when queer people try to latch onto only the positive, the empowering, etc., we forget some key aspects of our history and how queer identity in the queer community has been formed. So I like Heather Love's description of both queer politics and queer historiography for this reason. So she talks about how instead of relying on the discourse of progress and achievement, acceptance, etc., she says we need to dwell at least somewhat on what she calls backwards feelings. So anger, disgust, depression, all of those things, instead of trying to ignore those emotions that we feel based on our experiences as queer people and as the queer community. So she talks about, quote, for groups constituted by historical injury, the challenge is to engage with the past without being destroyed by it. So for me, the current engagement in both literature and media with the AIDS epidemic, for me, is partly a way that we can engage with this very harmful, depressing, devastating moment without, right, being destroyed by it. So that is another part of my kind of answer to that question of why this exigency, why this return, right? So it's a way to engage with this in good ways, in productive ways. Laura Sam's work on the queer biopic in the AIDS era is also useful here. In this study, she looks at contemporaneous biopics that emerged from the new queer cinema of the early 1990s. And the way she talks about how those creators were using the biopic genre, I think is applicable here because we see a shift. The shift that she's talking about, I think, is still present today. So she talks about a epistemological moment of rupture where our understanding of queerness, of queer identity, of the queer community changes, right, due to this rupture. This, she calls it the time of queer life's fragility, right? So for her, it changes. I think she talks about how queerness is built, defined, but for me, the more important concern is memorialized. How do we memorialize those who are lost while continuing on into the future, right? While still staying in the present and the future. She says about the moment of rupture, she says that it reoriented how queers understood what it means to have and live a life. So for me, this is a way that we can kind of, again, frame what contemporary writers and creators are doing as in this kind of still continuing this project. She says, and if you'll indulge me, I'll read this full quotation. She says, quote, "The desire to see individuals' lives takes on a particular intensity for queer communities during the AIDS crisis, who in the face of death, loss, and a totalizing assault on queer selfhood needed to see images of those lives lost as well as those continuing to live in the face of those losses." We'll return to STAM a little bit later. Okay, so let me kind of talk about one of the first text, Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian. Again, this is a historical fiction novel, and we have our three characters here. Now, what is interesting about the novel is that as a YA book, it uses the teenager's perspective of the crisis of the AIDS epidemic. And from that, it offers a kind of different view or understanding because the language differs, right? So Reza, from the outset, there's a paranoia. Again, he's a closeted queer kid, an Iranian immigrant, etc. He's so afraid of AIDS, and he doesn't understand what it is, how it's transferred, et cetera, et cetera. So Nazemian really leans into this in terms of how he describes it. So for example, in the first quote that I note here, he gets an injury and he won't let his mother touch him because he says, well, maybe just my gay thoughts, right, is what has produced AIDS, has made me infected with AIDS. I mean, that's pretty startling, right? But because queerness and queer desire become so intimately involved or entangled with death and illness, then it makes sense that a young I think he's a high school junior, wouldn't be able to process this. Even more so, this last quote I find heartbreaking. He says, "I need to live, and to live, I can't ever be what I know I am." Right? So to live, he needs to deny his queerness. Now, we have Art, who is openly queer. And for him, it becomes, I understand AIDS to an extent, but then how do I live a queer life in the face of this epidemic? How do I proceed in a crisis like this? So, for example, he asks, who will love me when all they'll see when they look at me is the possibility that I may kill them? Now, later in the novel, Reza and Art do start a relationship, and both of them are so afraid that they will not have kind of intimacy for a long time. They won't even kiss for a long time, etc. So we have these teenagers having to reckon with the devastation of the AIDS crisis. Now, I want to shift, though, our attention to what I'm particularly interested in, which is AIDS activism. So contemporaneous AIDS activism. So from the late 80s, say 88 to 92, 93. The reason why I use those dates is because that's when ACT UP New York the most influential organization in AIDS activism. Those are its years of existence, is 88 to 93. So that's considered kind of the height of AIDS activism. I This is where the title comes from. So, Anonymous Queers was a small group of just kind of ragtag queer people who released this polemic called Queers Read This. Sometimes you also see it called I Hate Straights. I avoided that one a little bit. So, Queers Read This. I wanted to highlight some passages here because this gives you a sense of the spirit of AIDS activism and why it was so radical. Okay. So, one of the kind of things that's often puzzled me is when we're talking about this contemporary AIDS literature, why don't we have a literature of the post-Stonewall era, right? The height of gay liberation. Why not that moment as a kind of key moment to probe into, to portray, memorialize, etc.? Why instead this? And I would argue in part it's because this was the genuine queer politics that most contemporary queer people really long for in the age of queer normalization, right? So the radical quality of this that shaped queer identity in important ways. So, for example, this is how the pamphlet talks about the AIDS epidemic, calling it institutionalized violence, perhaps more dangerous to the existence of queers because the attackers are faceless. They conclude, they will beat us and kill us before they will continue to live with us. Another example is they talk about hating to convince straight people that lesbians and gays live in a war zone surrounded by bomb blasts. Only we seem to hear that our bodies and souls are heaped high, dying of grief or disease, so forth. So the tenor of this is what gives you a sense of AIDS activism and why I think most of us would find it quite inspiring. Now, I noted that both of these novels are historical fiction, placing fictional characters within real historical events. I also want to backtrack a little bit and say My Government Means to Kill Me is even more interesting as historical fiction because Newson actually brings in real historical figures and fictionalizes stories surrounding them. So Bayard Rustin, the famous civil rights icon, is a key character. He frequents the same bathhouses as our main character, Trey. And then Larry Kramer, right, the kind of a key voice in AIDS activism, literature, etc. One of the kind of key ways that we integrate these characters into the historical moment is through AIDS activist moments. Okay, so Art from the beginning is involved in ACT UP along with Judy's uncle, Stephen, the one who's dying of AIDS. And so Art is young and involved in it. And he ends up taking part in some of the key protests that actually did happen. And we'll talk about a little bit of those. What I really like is how he tries to grapple with, well, what is the impulse behind this activism? Why do I want to put my body on the line, risk arrest, etc.? He says that all this love only makes me want to fight harder because if love is this beautiful, then anyone standing in the way of it is even more evil than I thought. So for him, that goes back to that quote I read earlier about how can I live or how can I love when all someone is going to see with me is death, right? So this becomes a kind of key impulse for him. So 3 protests are featured in Like a Love Story. The first is the first protest at the New York Stock Exchange, which is referenced in the newspaper clipping at the bottom. So this protest was aimed toward the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, who made the drug AZT. AZT originated in the 1960s or was studied in the 1960s and 70s as a treatment for cancer. It was found not effective, so it was kind of shelved. But then when AIDS came along, it was touted as kind of the drug, right? The drug to maintain, and all of that. Now, the problem was that it wasn't effective, and in fact, it was so toxic that it actually made people deteriorate faster. However, it was the only medicine on the market. So what do you do? Now, the problem is that the medication was in 1980s dollars was over 10,000 per year, right? So in today's, that would be us paying $23,000 a year for one medication, right? So this protest took aim at Burroughs Wellcome and the New York Stock Exchange for their kind of greed and et cetera. The second one is the Stop the Church action, which targeted Cardinal O'Connor, who was opposing condoms, sex education in schools. It was actually discouraging people from using condoms and saying it caused AIDS. Anyway, so needless to say, he wasn't, a favorite of AIDS activists at the moment. Then the last one is the Storm the National Institute of Health action, which was meant to try and get some changes involved in drug testing, and drug trials, that type of thing. So all three of these are featured directly in Like a Love Story. And we will see the New York Stock Exchange one in just a moment as well. So why, again, is AIDS activism this important? I want you to keep that in mind. Now, in My Government Means to Kill Me, as I noted, Trey, our protagonist, he undergoes a change midway through. When he moves to New York, it's kind of he goes to the bathhouses, he kind of chills out, that type of thing. Doesn't take life too seriously. But then midway through the kind of tutelage of Bayard, he starts to kind of change in how he approaches queerness, etc. So in fact, by the kind of end of the novel, we have a very strong activist. We have someone who has a strong political worldview and has a radical queer political worldview, which is even more important, I would argue. So, for example, in this passage that I'm highlighting here, he takes aim at what he calls the assimilationist gaze, what Michael Warner would call the good gays versus the bad queers, right? And so Trey definitely aligns himself with that latter group of the bad queers, right? Not afraid of sexuality, not afraid of confrontation, so on and so forth. So, for example, he talks about the assimilationist gaze as yearning to reassure the heady population that they shared its concerns about radicalism and the unruly side of the gay agenda. In another part from which this is taken, so he becomes involved in ACT UP in its earliest stages. And while he's undergoing his training in civil disobedience, he has this realization, and this is from where the title of the novel is taken. He says, "Why did the promises of America, the beautiful America, the land of liberty, and America, the shining city upon the hill, ring false to me? Why did I feel hunted in my own homeland? Because my government means to kill me." Now, he's talking about in an intersecting way, both in terms of his race, right, as being a person of color, and then also his queerness. So how are those intersecting? And that becomes a kind of key motivation for him. Now, as promised, I said that we would see this protest again. Toward the end of the novel, Trey, like art, takes part in the protest at the New York Stock Exchange. They set outside and block an intersection so that to protest. He talks about the financial profiteers of the New York Stock Exchange, the FDA, a rat's nest of bureaucrats. And then lastly, the rapacious pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome. And this is a picture taken from the actual protest itself. So he takes part in this. He is arrested, so on and so forth. So that becomes a kind of central thing in the novel. Okay, so to kind of conclude, I'm thinking about I want to walk around. I'm a teacher, so I usually walk around. Um, so when we're thinking about the reasons why, the exigencies, right? I want to think about the kind of way we can have continuities with the present, as well as recognizing, right, progress since the past, etc. So how can we do that? So Laura Stam, I think, provides a useful framework for kind of understanding the moment where we're in when it comes to our place within history post the AIDS crisis. She talks about there being a duality uh, of perception, right? Of saying we're both kind of past the worst of the AIDS crisis, but then it still lingers within the present, right? So it's a way of not denying either the continuity of this kind of history or the persistence of HIV/AIDS as a problem, right? So we have this kind of duality that we kind of have to coexist with. So she talks about this contemporary artist, Kia LaBeija, and LaBeija is an HIV positive woman, and she really explores her position as an HIV positive person. And so what Stam says is that this artist, by directly kind of drawing on her experiences, shows the continuity of this crisis within the present. So she talks about the duality representative of the AIDS pandemic's temporality. So we memorialize the past while still recognizing this era and this disease as part of the present. So what I think kind of represents this duality is in the final scene of Like a Love Story. Now, all of the previous sections are set in 89 and 90. However, and that's supposed to say, yeah, okay. But the final section is told from Art's perspective, and it's set in 2016. Why is that important? It takes place the day after the Pulse shooting, the Orlando shooting, right, that targeted queer people, killed 49 in a queer club. So it takes place the day after that. Now, that's important, but also Art has tested positive for HIV himself. He talks about benefiting from current drugs and so forth, but the fact that he is positive, again, brings that to the present. But then also the Pulse shooting is what shows continuity between this kind of moment of historical injury, right? As we talked about at the beginning, this time of queer life's fragility with the AIDS epidemic. Well, seeing 49 queer people gunned down is probably a similar touch, right? So there was a newspaper article that talked about it as representing a queer pain that has a long lineage. So Art directly brings in these two together when he talks about the name of the Pulse Club as being named to remember the owner's brother who died of AIDS in honor of his pulse to keep living, keep fighting. So even just within that name of the nightclub itself, we have continuities. Then Art kind of concludes that being together as queer people is what is needed to make sense of this pain in this historical moment. So what I would argue is a couple of things that I think are important. Is number one, I think that a lot of queer people are hesitant to fully embrace the progress narrative of queer life now, right? So if we think that we're just at this pinnacle of progress and acceptance, well, we ignore a lot of realities, such as the epidemic of, the violence against trans women of color, et cetera. So being skeptical of the progress narrative itself, a dissatisfaction with the kind of politics of normalization. So getting back to that instead radically queer moment or that radical queer activism, so on and so forth. I think those are the reasons we keep kind of going backwards. Now, to end, I like Stam's argument that the AIDS crisis is a moment that is still with us today and cannot be quarantined to the past. And instead, we kind of need to tap into that historical moment and probe its relevance for us today. Okay, so thank you. And I'll take any questions.
I have a mic for people with questions.
Okay.
But I was curious if you could share more about the NIH. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let me repeat the question through the mic just for the Zoom audience.
Okay.
So the question was if you could share more about the NIH protest and how that featured into the novel. Okay.
Yeah, so the NIH protest was similar to it was inspired by one of their earlier protests, earlier protests called Storm the FDA, where they focused on the FDA and tried to take over a building there. But by 1990, there's still a lot of inaction surrounding drug trials, or there are still issues with drug trials. And so ACT UP kind of orchestrated this protest at the NIH where a lot of these trials were taking place and focused primarily on Dr. Fauci, who we probably all are familiar with that name at this point. Now, I do want to say that this protest was kind of critiqued by some ACT UP members because they felt it wasn't really needed, right? It was kind of, anyway. If you're interested in that, Sarah Schulman's book, Let the Record Show, really explores those. In the novel, interestingly enough, it's Stephen, the uncle who is dying of AIDS. There's been a rift between the three teenagers. So he asked basically as his dying wish that they all three go to the protest together at the NIH. And then in that kind of moment is when Judy can finally express, her anger or sadness about her uncle dying. The rift between all of them is kind of mended. And so it's really interesting as this kind of moment of reconciliation and the last wish of a person dying with AIDS. So that's kind of its role in the novel. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, no problem.
We have another question here. I have so many questions, but I'll try to have one. So it seems that novels, this is a broad stroking, it seems like novels are a way to explore how we're living in the time we're living, or how we were living in a time before we are living now, and reckoning with this concept of skepticism of the progress narrative. Like that really struck me in your talk. That feels really current and true. And I felt that deeply when you said it. And I wonder if there are writers out there that you've come across who are exploring that nugget of, because that also feels to me very true to what I hear from students of this. I do feel like we've sort of spent a couple decades celebrating a bunch of progress, and it felt like that's how I grew up. But now I feel like I'm living in a time when we don't know how much progress we actually made.
Right.
And your talk brings up, how can novels help us explore the possibilities so we can figure out how to live? So I'm just curious what comes to mind from that question.
Yeah, very good. So I think, of course, my specialization is kind of in this area. And, but there is a lot of really good work being done, especially when it comes to intersectionality. So, for example, we talk about marriage equality, but we don't talk about the impact of, a person with a disability losing access to disability, right? Because they get married, or just the intersectionality of race and gender, et cetera, when it comes to this. So there's a good book called Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H., where she talks about the intersection of Islamophobia, racism, queerness, and misogyny. And basically her account is a way to say, like, in the post 9/11 world, et cetera, I'm still the marginalized figure. So I think those moments are maybe not an overt critique of the progress narrative, but it definitely is a kind of implied skepticism of this kind of moment of achievement, right? For the most part, I think the discourse surrounding marriage equality, for example, is a kind of key thing here, where a lot of us are like, okay, well, if marriage exists, sure, queer people need to be able to marry freely, right? But what are we overlooking? For example, the fact that trans women of color are just, murdered consistently. Marriage equality does not help save their lives. So I think there's a general discourse also around this kind of skepticism.
More questions? Yeah.
Excellent presentation. And I've read Like a Love Story, and I love that book. So book rec. I'm looking forward to reading the other. So that one image that's really famous of the guy with the leather jacket, and on the back it says, if I die of AIDS, leave my body on the steps of the FDA. I feel like that really was everywhere for me in my circles when the pandemic started. And brought kind of this AIDS epidemic history back for younger audiences. I'm wondering if in literature and what you study, if there's been an uptick of like literature utilizing the AIDS history since the pandemic started, or if you've seen any interaction between that discussion of the pandemic and the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, I can't really think of a lot of examples where it's kind of post-pandemic, except for My Government Means to Kill Me. So released in 2022. So it is really interesting that we have a novel called My Government Means to Kill Me during the height of a pandemic, which someone was mismanaged a little bit. But what I think is more important beyond fiction, if you'll indulge me, is when we think about the response to the COVID pandemic, the disparities are kind of key here. The fact that Reagan didn't even utter the word AIDS in public until I think 86, 87, whereas the first reported case is in 1981, versus during the COVID pandemic, we have a vaccine in 2 years. Right. So early on, I knew a lot of people were trying to draw parallels, but for, I think, most of us, and I think that a novel like My Government Means to Kill Me highlights, is the disparities when it's certain groups affected versus the broader population, right? So if it's just queer people, if it's just drug users or that type of thing, then those who are expendable, right, are why take action, right? So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question.
I have a comment towards the question that I think also relates to a question that I had. So let me see if I can get my brain on track at this hour. But I think regarding the relationship between like the AIDS pandemic and the COVID pandemic, I actually gave a conference presentation some years back, but it was analyzing how representations of disease during the pandemic, specifically as they related to kind of anti-Asian sentiment, were these pathologized representations that did engage in sort of queering, or like, well, not queering in a good way, that basically represented this deviancy of the origins of the disease. So in that way, it's using these entangled discourses of race and sexuality and, of course, like global power dynamics. And we see this in a lot of instances, but so, and just one example of this was, there was a South Park episode. And in the South Park episode, I think it was something like Mickey Mouse was like the one spreading the disease, but that's because Mickey Mouse had gone to Wuhan and had sex with a bat. So it's these kinds of, so that actually draws from this kind of pathologization of gay sex as deviant, as animalistic, and all of these things in this very racist kind of entanglement. So I just thought of that in relation to your question. And that was kind of, my question was like, so how can we, there is this kind of the pathologized discourse towards LGBT plus persons that is so, didn't start during the AIDS pandemic, but really was heightened during that time. And this idea of like deservingness to die.
Right, right.
How can we draw from that to look at, like, how does that still show up even in comments, for example, like against the conference? You know, how do people recycle that sort of deviancy that comes out of the AIDS crisis in these ongoing anti-LGBT like attacks?
Very good question. Yeah, and so I wanted to, based on like your comment and question, I wanted to backtrack a little bit when we're talking about the post-AIDS discourse. Is we are trying to ignore that modern queerness is in part defined as a pathologized identity, right, since the AIDS epidemic. So this is a key difference between someone getting COVID, that's not a moral failing or deserved, whereas someone getting HIV AIDS during this time, right, it's because you are deviant, it's because you are pathologized, and therefore it's a moral failing, right? So we have, if we try to ignore that, then we ignore a kind of key part of what you're getting to. If you listen to how, for example, I was in a library board meeting, and this is when they were banning, they banned 3 queer-themed books. You would think that queer people are the most disgusting things on the planet, right? It was framed as, this is just morally corrupt. It's going to morally corrupt our kids. How can we even kind of broach these issues? We're not going to sexualize children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we see the kind of the idea of spreading queerness, right? Contamination via queerness, even just talking about a fictional account, right? So the book that, Like a Love Story, recently pulled off the shelves of Rutherford County public school, in public school libraries, right? Secretly, quietly. But I think that discourse shows how we're still dealing with a pathologized identity in terms of spreading queerness, it being a moral failing that then can transfer to other people, right? So anyway, so I think that's one of the dangers in ignoring how modern queerness has been defined or shaped via something like the AIDS crisis.
Questions from this side of the room? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could recommend some more books that are similar to like a love story.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also I'll recommend some media as well. One that, of course, I didn't get to talk about today, like I said, is The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles. It's very unique in that it follows, we all know about the men who went home to die. That's what we often talk about. It actually follows a character back home, where he kind of faces the stigma of AIDS from his family, community, etc. That's the number one I would recommend. There's another one called The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay. That's pretty good. Then there is one called Tell the Wolves I'm Home, and the author of it is escaping my mind at the moment. It's pretty good. The only thing that can be a problem in AIDS literature or AIDS media writ large is the gay white male victim of AIDS, that it can be kind of a cliche. So that's why I like Why My Government Means to Kill Me, as it follows a person of color. So I would say those three, or even better, especially if you like, has anyone watched Pose or Paris is Burning? The House of Impossible Beauties is a historical fiction that takes some of the ballroom figures and rewrites the narrative. So I would suggest it as well. It's a delightful read. In terms of other media, I would say film would be 120 BPM, 120 beats per minute, which follows Act Up Paris. And then in terms of television, if you haven't seen the miniseries It's a Sin from HBO, that's a great one as well. So those are some recommendations.
Awesome. More questions?
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. I feel like I come back to this all the time when we talk with students, and when I talk, I'll talk about talking with administration about LGBT issues. But we have to own this past of like, this is a big part of like queer history, is this, the AIDS epidemic that we went through and experienced. But at the same time, there's like this duality of then it becomes like the stereotype of only the queer community that like gets HIV or AIDS, and then like feeds into some of that, I think, stigmatization and demonizing of the queer community. And so do you have thoughts on how you talk about that, or how some of this literature that you've talked about presents that in a way that like owns that history without becoming further stigmatizing?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because like we talked about, of course, we don't want queerness linked up to shame, fear,
The horror.
and horror. We don't want that, right? But you're right. We can't deny that the existence of that history and the fact that those have shaped modern queer identity. Where I think our biggest kind of opportunity comes from is looking at the history of AIDS activism, for example, and the queer community's reaction to AIDS. So if we talk about the network of lesbians, for example, who created hospices, that's showing queer solidarity while recognizing this was a terrible time for queer people. Or ACT UP, really exploring the history of it and how it represents such a radical moment for queer politics and community amidst a very challenging period, right? So you're right. You don't want to kind of keep linking queerness with AIDS, et cetera, but the reality is there. That's why I think that novels like My Government Means to Kill Me or Like a Love Story are very powerful in teaching that history without replicating it. So for example, in My Government Means to Kill Me, Trey goes to the bathhouses, right, which were stigmatized during this time as spreading HIV, AIDS, right? But the writer Newson, he talks about it being a sex positive novel, right, in a period when sex negativity was kind of a key thing. So he says people still had fun during the epidemic, right? It didn't just stop queer life altogether. So I think those are some avenues there. And I think I think for me, even more importantly, is that queer people need to be having these discussions about this history and its implications for us now. For example, with the progress narrative, how can we continue to critique that to advance a truly queer agenda?
It's interesting too that even as AIDS certainly created this stigmatized identity specifically for queers, but it was also like it kind of made sex scary, like entirely in the 80s, right? Like who were children in the 80s? Like in the 80s, like it was like you can kiss anybody. Like there was a lot of fear, and so there's something interesting related there. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that? There's entanglements with like hetero, like fears also of sex and maybe, sex education, safe sex, like sex as bad, right?
Right. So I'll take an angle to that question in terms of how queer people engage with sex positivity or sex negativity in the post-AIDS world. We're talking about that moment of rupture, right? And so for me, born in 1990, I can't imagine the world before HIV/AIDS, right? So that kind of moment of sexual freedom that people talk about as being in the 1970s for queer people, that's unimaginable, right? Just like my nephew will never know a world without COVID, right? It's just now going to become ingrained in that history. So that's what I think a lot of queer people, particularly queer men, negotiate is sexual empowerment while recognizing the reality, right, that we have here. But in general, the kind of hysteria surrounding sexuality and the fact that, again, AIDS becomes a moral failing. It becomes you're overly sexualized or you're, risking things for no reason, etc. That's where I think that kind of sex negativity from the heady population, as Trey Singleton would say, is. Sorry, that's a roundabout way to kind of address your question.
We do have 5 more minutes, so.
So building off the talking about I like the general fear of sex from the AIDS crisis and whatnot, and also given your focus on literature and the example where you talked about with the book banning discourse. I was curious, given your research interest, is the discourse or rhetoric regarding the term decadence, especially like in the late 19th century, any of that work, does that intersect in any way, or do you find interest in that? Or
can you elaborate just a little bit on that?
So especially like given, so decadence was kind of a general term at the end of the 19th century to describe what was perceived as dangerous, diseased, metaphor, art, sexuality, of course, certainly more associated with promiscuity and whatnot. So I was just curious if you had any kind of intersection with that literature too.
No, I haven't actually really explored that, but obviously there are the commonalities because, right, the HIV/AIDS was blamed on queer, overindulgence of various forms, right? So I'm sure there are definitely some key parallels there. Sorry, I don't have a fuller answer.
Oh, no problem. It was just curious.
I think one thing that's really interesting that you both bring up is sort of sometimes we think of ourselves as being from an era and it being fixed in time, right? So like I was born in the 70s. You talked about when you were born. You asked if anyone else knows, what it was like. Yeah. But we are all in these intergenerational relationships. So like the community becomes made of people who are coming from these different moments in time that couldn't possibly know from before that moment in time. And to bring it full circle to the book you were talking about, this relationship between the uncle and the young people, I think, is really important in that how that individual is I haven't read the book, but how that person is experiencing their medical condition and also their potential future at the same time that these young people are coming into the very beginning of their journey in life is a perfect picture in many ways about how our community does intergenerationally seek to relate. And I guess I just wanted to kind of draw a line between that because I thought that was like a interesting moment.
Right. I'm glad you bring that up. I can point to a specific moment within the text. Now, I do want to say, reading Nazemian's interviews surrounding it, he said in his first therapy sessions, he had to deal with the legacy of the AIDS crisis because he was very young during it. So he still had to deal with that. But there's a moment where, Stephen's, the uncle's partner, had died of AIDS. And then, of course, he's dying of AIDS. And he says that I remember the before, and I could have sex with my partner without risk, without that fear of queer sex being death, right? And he says, I'm sad that you're never going to experience that. You're always going to be in this in this crisis or afterward. So he says, I can't imagine not ever having that freedom. So there is this comment, right, for a young writer talking about that before period. So we have that kind of thing. Now, what I think is also important in terms of discussions of AIDS discourse, queer politics, etc., is we also have to reckon with the loss of so many queer people, particularly queer men. You lose a generation of queer men. So I think that's also part of this impulse to return to this moment via media and fiction, is to recover that cultural memory that may be kind of lost to a certain extent. So I think generational bridges are important in a lot of ways.
I think that wraps us up. Thank you for a really provocative talk and discussion session.
Thank y'all.
Dr. Hughes. Technology is not my friend today. Dr. Hughes, Dr. Chevret, we want to appreciate you and your time today. And on behalf of the conference planners, supporters, MTSU Lambda Association, the College of Behavioral and Health Sciences, and the Conference Advisory Board, thank you for your support for our efforts in presenting this conference. We want to especially thank you for your commitment to standing strong, and we ask that you accept this small token of our appreciation.